Welcome to Not Local. I'm Zeke. I wanted to examine one particularly concerning issue in society right now that for many Americans is very familiar: misinformation and disinformation. This topic really made itself visible during the US presidential elections in 2016, and after some investigation, a bipartisan Senate Select Committee on Intelligence indeed concluded that there were concerted efforts by Russians to sow dis and misinformation online, creating distrust and skepticism about the upcoming election. This problem has not gone away since and has been a topic of growing concern, not just in the United States, but globally. My guest today is Professor Anurag Mehra. He is an associate professor at the Center of Policy Studies at the Indian Institute of Technology at Bombay. Professor Mehra has a PhD in chemical engineering from Bombay University, has been a visiting professor at MIT, and teaches courses on society, technology, and policy, and how they overlap. Professor Mehra has written about mis and disinformation on multiple occasions and brings an external lens to this issue that I found very useful. It was a pleasure to speak with Professor Mehra, and I hope you get the same utility out of it that I did. And now I give you Professor Mehra. All right, to start off, can you tell me a bit about your background and where you're from and what life was like growing up for you?
Well, I'm from the north of India, from a city called Allahabad, which has now been renamed as Prayagraj. I grew up in Uttar Pradesh, which is the northern state in India. And I did my schooling there. And then I went to the Indian Institute of Technology at Kanpur, where I studied chemical engineering. And then I graduated from there, moved to Bombay, did a master's and a PhD. And took up employment in IIT Bombay since 1991. By training, I am a chemical engineer. And I happened to move on to policy, I think partly driven by two converging concerns. One was that I think I had had enough of conventional engineering and so on. It was okay, but I think the whole digital universe was sort of, overpowering us in many ways, and therefore there was a need to look at other things. And I maybe a little jaded of teaching engineering and not looking at other stuff. And the other good thing was that our institute started this new Center for Policy Studies, I think in 2016. And they were aware that I had some interest in, social and political issues and so on. And so I became an associate faculty at the center. And initially, I was focusing on online courses, MOOCs, and their impact and use in India and so on. And I had a PhD student working on it who graduated last year. And but then after that, my focus shifted more to misinformation, disinformation, and that kind of stuff. And especially during the COVID time, what kind of things were done and not done, or not done properly, and so on. Yeah, I think that's the kind of background. And I've been at this disinformation business now for a while. I have a PhD student who's about to graduate, and another one who's working on polarization in one of the southern states in India. So, yeah, I guess that's the context and the background.
Yeah, that's great. I was going to ask you about how a chemical engineer comes to start focusing on mis and disinformation, but you beat me to it. So I guess how did you, specifically about mis and disinformation, how did you become focused on that particular area? And, I know about you because of the article you wrote about misinformation and COVID-19, but were you aware of it before that? Did you focus on it before that? Or is that what drew it to your attention?
No, I've been involved in this misinformation, disinformation business for a while now. And I think a major trigger was, first of all, was general reading. So I read a couple of very interesting books, and they kind of pointed out to what kind of problems we might face. But that was very preliminary sort of reading. The second factor I think that played a major role was I have been involved with computers ever since my professional career, in the sense of, when I was a young faculty member, I was the faculty system administrator for my department.
Hmm.
And so my association, I've always been a great Linux enthusiast. Then I was chair of the computer center, the computing unit inside IIT Bombay. It's not the computer science department, but a separate facility.
Hmm.
So in general, my involvement with computers and digital stuff has been there for a very, very long time, since maybe the late 90s or, I've always been for my own professional work in chemical engineering, I used to do a lot of numerical computing. So I think I moved on to this because, and I think the third trigger would be the kind of politics that was evolving everywhere and polarization and so on. 2016, I think, is a good enough time for, that's the time you actually begin to see effects of some of this stuff in the US and in India and many other countries.
Yeah.
So I think all of that converged, and then I thought that was a nice area to, and specifically my concern has been very sharply focused on disinformation and politics.
Definitely connects to what was happening here, especially as you said in 2016. We had the whole Russian dis and misinformation campaign that has been well documented now.
Yeah.
So specifically on India now, what are some of the challenges that India specifically has been facing in terms of mis and disinformation? And how have you perceived that phenomenon has affected people in India?
So I think there are a lot of similarities between a lot of countries, including the US and India. I think we have a large, very significant population which is formally educated, but lacks, the ability to think critically and so on, which I think has to do with the nature of our education system. And this would probably be true of a lot of Asian countries and, maybe places like Turkey and maybe East European nations and so on also. It's also true in the US, where things are a little different, in the sense there are entire communities where people haven't studied beyond high school, or, they basically haven't gone to college at all.
Mm.
And so I think what it does is that it creates a very fertile ground for conspiracy theories, or, believing in stuff which is outright bizarre. Also, I think it gives very easy sort of traction to identity politics. Now, identity politics plays out in different countries very differently. So, a white, disempowered worker in Detroit versus, let's say, a middle class person in India, who for some reason both lack the critical ability to not latch onto, a very easy, convenient, simplified form of polarized politics. So, I mean, as I said, the reasons have nuances why they're different, but broadly, I think there is a very large segment of the population that is prone to two things: identity politics and conspiracy theories, which makes it very easy for political parties, for politicians in general, their supporters to, supporters would mean people who may not directly participate in politics, but provide a cultural context to the whole polarization process. It's this basic sort of thrust that you see, which allows a lot of disinformation to actually propagate. It gets taken in, people believe in it, people act on it, and the ability to counter it is typically lacking. Don't have the resources for. There are also subtle psychological traits of misinformation which make this very convenient. It's simple. The messaging is very simple. It just takes out all sense of nuance. It makes everything black and white. and it allows you to make easy enemies and easy friends. I mean, basically, what I'm now trying to say is what has also happened is that politics is now sort of conducted more through the construction of narratives,
Yeah.
and sometimes maybe completely antithetical to the actual material interests in whose name it is being propagated. So, for example, take unemployment. It's like sometimes those segments of the population which are intensely affected by lack of employment or underemployment, or they've been laid off, they are the ones who are most likely to actually support narratives which will pin the blame on, say, immigrants, on or on something else, a different religion, some communal angle to it. So basically, what is happening is a materially based, material interpretation based, reason or evidence based understanding is simply replaced by stories and narratives and kind of system of beliefs which then tends to overshadow everything else. So I am poor, but I don't really care about that. What I care about is the fact that somebody is telling me that I am poor because there's a lot of immigration into the country, which is absolutely not the reason for that person's poverty at all.
Right.
So I think this is the core of why disinformation then becomes a very important part, because that's where conspiracy theories arise from. And very often there are state and non-state actors who do this very actively to confuse the electoral the voters and general belief system. Create a more an atmosphere which is driven more and more, let's say, into a more right-wing kind of semi-fascist kind of understanding of society.
Yeah, what you said about identity politics really resonates here too, because I mean, as you said, we have people who are pretty firmly entrenched in their current views, and their current views are very much colored by who they perceive as their community, and that that touches their ethnicity, that touches their sexual identity, it touches their politics. And I think what you just said is very prescient, because what I don't see in the mis and disinformation space is that targeted towards people who are not already captured by identity. And so if you can find those communities, and they're quite easy to find on social media, all of the people who are, identified as this, immutable trait communities, they're very easy to find and therefore very easy to target. So yeah, that resonates quite well with an American as well. All right, so as a professor now, have you noticed that the online information space has helped students or hurt students, and or both? And if you can, do you have any examples of that?
So I think students are probably affected in the same way as the general population around you, because they come from very diverse backgrounds. So if there is a student who comes from a background where people are very religious, or there's a very strong current of identity-based, stuff in the house itself. For example, people believe a lot in caste, which is a very peculiarly Indian sort of institution where, the simplest way to define it is that people belong to different castes, and those different castes are supposed to perform different functions. So people at the lower end are supposed to do manual work or, dirty work, and people at the top are the ones who just learn and, who are the ones who have all the knowledge and the ones who should be studying. So in many places, despite, people may be very upper class, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're very cosmopolitan, or that they do not have a caste-based understanding, or rather more than understanding, a caste-based worldview of themselves and of others. So it depends on where students come from. If a student comes from a background where, people are fairly liberal, those students also generally tend to be more liberal, more cosmopolitan, are not easily taken in by, let's say, identity-based arguments or stupid conspiracy theories and so on. But on the other hand, if you come from a very religious family, or where a lot of people believe in these things, like maybe your parents or your siblings or your cousins, then they are more prone to this kind of thing. So it's
Mhm.
hard to generalize because in the institute itself, there's this entire spectrum of people from all across, religions, communities, castes, socioeconomic groups, and so on. So I guess, I mean, there's no clear-cut answer to this question. What I would say is that there are students who are able to see through it, who remain firmly committed to reason, evidence. They are
Mhm.
rational. They don't get taken in by a lot of the stuff that floats around. But I think there's a much larger number of students who are probably influenced in the other direction. But
Mhm.
I think this simply reflects the fact that there is probably a much larger proportion of people from middle class families or upper class families from where our students are derived. So, as is the case in the outside community in their families, the same gets reflected inside the university.
Mhm. You mentioned caste as sort of a segregating factor in India. Now, for people who are, I guess, less familiar with Indian culture, and I suppose I fit into this bucket now because I am aware of what the caste system was. I was not aware that it still impacted society in a like sort of a severe way. And you're saying that it still is very much present and a dividing
Yeah, again,
line.
I think it depends. If you're in a village or a small town, the impact is much more than if you're in a cosmopolitan place like, let's say, Mumbai.
Mm,
But it's also very deeply internal. Let me give you a very simple analogy. Is the impact that, I mean, you don't have slaves in the US today, but
hmm
slavery as an institution and the residue that is left behind. I
hmm
mean, you still have people taking down Confederate statues, and you still have fights about what is correct history and what is bad history. You still have, all kinds of denialism which says, remove these books from libraries.
hmm
So it's different, but
Okay.
I think it serves as an analogy that it still, even though slavery ended formally in many ways, it still has a huge impact. And why do we say that? Even in direct terms, I think in many parts of the US, I think the discrimination against blacks persists. Again, depend how small the place is, where is it,
hmm
it is located, and whether it's deep south or whether it's. I mean, you will not see it in New England, but you see it in Texas in many parts. So I think it's something like that. The expression of how much it impacts your life varies from location, your class, origin, the caste you are in. So for instance, I mean, if I look at my father's generation or I look at my grandfather's generation, my grandfather migrated from Lahore, which is now in Pakistan, to
hmm
India. So he was technically a refugee. But I think my grandfather was a fairly liberal person in terms of he had Muslim friends. He was not bitter towards Muslims just because the partition happened and they had to leave their ancestral land and house and start all over again in India.
hmm
And the same is true of my dad. But I know a lot of people in both the generations who were extremely bitter, sort of angry, and held communal feelings about other religions and so on. So I guess it all depends upon. But overall, yes, I would say that caste sometimes in very unsubtle and very sort of in your face forms, and sometimes in very subtle sort of forms. It does affect everything that happens around you. From simple
That's
things like
interesting.
dining, socializing, to jobs, employment, how you talk to people, how you treat them. I think it's there everywhere.
It's a effective analogy, I'd say. Yeah, that's very interesting. We touched briefly on the United States, but just a little bit more color. What has your perception of the United States been over the course of your life, and has it changed at all?
That's actually a question which probably has a very long answer. But the institute that I studied in, the IIT Kanpur, was actually established with American assistance. So it was, quote unquote, one of the most American institutions in the country. It was modeled after MIT, and we had a lot of faculty who taught there. But I mean, most of them were not there when I graduated, but their imprint and the impact of the American system. So it was basically like an American island in a North Indian state, you know. Almost, I should say, there was a time when maybe 80-90% of the people just simply went to the US for graduate studies. So our impression, of course, was very positive, and at that time maybe a little naive and uninformed. But then I think as I grew more politically sort of aware, and I made a conscious decision not to do graduate studies in the US because I wanted to be in Indian academics. So I did my graduate stuff right here in India. But overall, it's always been an extremely sort of it spells freedom, it spells opportunities. And I have spent, so even though I did not do my graduation there, but I have done 2 stints at MIT teaching chemical engineering students. I spent the first half of last year at Vassar College in Poughkeepsie, where I actually taught a course on policies related to the internet and digital stuff. It is called Digital Lives. So I've been a fairly frequent sort of visitor, and I spent time with students. I have been assisted by TAs, some of whom were Korean, some Indian, and American. So I've had a fairly broad sort of exposure to the, and I have probably a reasonable sense of American politics and the way it proceeds. I mean, despite all that, it's a country I like. But I mean, that's actually a vague statement in a sense, because I mean, I like the friends I've made there. I like the atmosphere in the university that I've spent there. But of course, there are a lot of things which are starting from, let's say, when I first sort of stepped into adulthood, we talk about the Vietnam War, the anti-war protests, awareness of people like Noam Chomsky, for example. You read, when you read history, it's not just history of your own country. You read a more global sort of version of, There's also that awareness that, what happened in the US, for example, what does Biden offer versus what exactly is going on with the Republican Party. And
Yeah.
I think I have a fairly good handle on, and I do read about it. I subscribe to a lot of Washington Post, New York Times, The Atlantic, New York Review of Books. So it's a part of my daily, a part of it is also triggered by the association, and I'm keen to learn that, is technology and now AI and politics. And so this is my bread and butter. So I also read a lot about American politics in this very context, but often you end up reading a lot of other stuff, which is not directly related to technology, but yeah. So Wade versus Roe, for example, abortion rights in India versus abortion rights in the US, or what's happening in the European Union. So it's.
I think you would find that a lot of Americans have conflicted opinions of their own country right now too. So, that's a good answer. So moving back to mis and disinformation.
Yeah.
The United States has just had hearings in Congress about the risks of social media platforms, and most recently TikTok. Is the Indian government similarly focused on social media platforms themselves, or is the focus just on, broadly speaking, mis and disinformation?
It's actually quite complicated in some ways, but very simple in some other ways. So it's complicated in the sense that the Indian government tends to make laws which are pretty sort of, wide-ranging, and ostensibly the reason for some of the strictest laws to control content on the internet, which include social media websites. And so, for example, stuff that goes on Twitter, or stuff that gets posted on Facebook, or even just news websites, news portals. So they say we want to control the content because to keep the Indian public safe. And recently, they've gone so far so as to say that the government of India will actually have a fact-checking unit. And that unit will kind of have a legal monopoly over declaring what is true and what is false. Fortunately, the idea got nixed by the Indian Supreme Court. But it's always there in the works, in the background, and so on. So it's all in the name of the people. But I think the laws are extremely draconian. And we don't have anything like the First Amendment shield with us. So basically, the government can stop whatever it wants. And so I think, as I said, in one sense, it's very simple. It's simple in the sense you have a bunch of laws which are extremely powerful. They allow the government to, just basically write to Google and say, get this stuff off YouTube. And since you actually have a formal law, you can quote section this, under this you take it out. Those sections may be too drastic or draconian, but it doesn't matter to YouTube or Google, because Google says it's committed to obeying local laws, so it doesn't really have an option. I'm throwing the rule book at you. I'm telling you which section I'm quoting, and then I'm saying take this out. At a more complex level, things also operate. So, for example, India has banned TikTok long time back, but that was because of its bad relations with China. So one way of retaliating to Chinese aggression of any sort is to say that, they sell a lot of their products here, for example, mobile phones, and a lot of stuff that gets manufactured in India depends upon input from the Chinese and so on. So you can't retaliate by saying, we won't allow this in because that will disturb the market. But one easy way of doing this is to say, okay, we won't let some of your software sell here, or we ban a particular Chinese company from operating. So TikTok was banned, I don't remember exactly, maybe a couple of years ago. So you can't, unless you use a VPN, you can't really use TikTok in the country. But Twitter is here, and Facebook is here, and YouTube is here. And I think they all mostly comply with whatever the government of India tells them, because if they don't, then they have to pack their bags.
Right.
So, which is a very hard thing to do. It's a big market.
No one wants to lose that India market share.
We've been talking about a personal data protection law for very long now. Maybe 5 years, 6 years, maybe more than that. Maybe a decade. But we've not really, many drafts have come and gone, but they have never really entered our parliament for being passed and being converted into law. And every 2 years, new things happen. So if you go back 4 years, there was no AI. But now you have more stuff happening. So there's a new draft which is now being considered and so on. But in any case, the long and short of the story is that we don't have a data protection law right now which is there, which allows various agencies, government agencies, private agencies, anyone basically, to, pick up data, use it whichever way you want, because there's no clear framework which defines what is legal and what is illegal. I mean, the best contrast would be, look at the European Union. It's very clear what you can harvest, what kind of consent is required, how you should put cookies on your, websites, how can you use data, how can you even, whether you can aggregate it, not aggregate it, how do you treat anonymized data. Now, none of that exists over here. So it's basically a free for all playing field. Which means that, I think government agencies, private agencies can collect data in whichever way they want. And there's very, very, very little you can do about it. I mean, you can go to court and say, look, we do have a fundamental right to privacy and so on. So sometimes they do get sort of, pushed back because of if somebody goes and fights there. But the overarching framework that is required is yet not in place. Yeah, I think that's it. So disinformation is not being fought so much in terms of, say, creating digital literacy or, promoting more fact-check websites, or basically freeing the media to, be able to freely say whatever they want to say. So there is sort of a reasonable amount of control on what can go. As I said, it's not just YouTube and so on. Normal media portals can also be asked to take down stuff.
Mm.
So that's the way India tackles disinformation, misinformation kind of. And there are the associated problems that sometimes the disinformation itself comes from either state actors or non-state actors acting in support of the state. So depending
Mm.
upon the flavor of the state, left or right, or more sort of progressive or more conservative, the actions then tend to be in accordance with those kinds of beliefs, which are
Yeah,
dominant inside the government.
that was very much the 2016 program for Russia. It was favoring one side over another. So that is a common occurrence, apparently. Last question for you, Professor, and I thank you for giving me your time tonight. I know it's late there. So, in your experience, what has been the sentiment of people in India about this particular issue? And is it among the more talked about issues in the country, or is it sort of a background problem?
Well, it's very similar to the US. Very,
Hmm.
very similar to the US. So if you are a Trump believer, I may offer you whatever evidence that I can. It's not going to change your mind. The election was stolen means it was stolen. You can shout from the rooftops, do whatever you want. I'm not going to change my opinion. Okay? It's very similar here. So people who believe in more conservative values, who are supporters of the present government, they think that what, let's say, someone else would term as misinformation or a fact checker would call as a piece of disinformation or misinformation, they actually believe that to be true. And sometimes, not always, they would call the opposing view as being either a conspiracy, anti-national, or an attempt to mislead people. I mean, as I said, the easiest understood in terms of analogies. So, Fox News is
Hmm.
the repository of truth, and New York Times is the source of all the garbage that you see. Now, depending on which side of the fence you're on, there is very little you can do to change this opinion. So it's very similar here, though I would say that most media houses tend to be very careful because, as I said, we are not protected by the First Amendment or laws which are as deeply fundamental as that. So it's easier to get sort of in trouble. I guess that's one difference. But other than that, structurally, it's very similar to. So if you ask me for how people react, depend on whom I'm talking to. If I'm talking to somebody who's a conservative supporter who feels that the current dispensation is absolutely right, and everybody else is either a leftist, anti-national, or whatever. If you ask the other side, and they will say, well, this is all stuff which has no basis in reality. This is actually a conspiracy, but it seems to be peddled in such a fashion that it has become mainstream.
Hmm.
So I guess the kind of polarization that you see around you, and I think it's true of many countries. It's true of Hungary, it's true of Poland, it's true of Turkey, it's true
Hmm.
of Brazil. You name it, right? It's there everywhere. And I think hardcore supporters are very difficult to dissuade. And there is probably a middle ground. I don't know. I think it keeps shifting over the years. It becomes narrow and broad depending upon if you are close to an election, if people are forced to take positions, versus it's a period of relative relaxation. People are not really fighting. It's okay.
Hmm.
So I guess there is no universal answer to this question. But I think, yes, it indeed is a topic where people do talk about it. And we've just recently had elections to the federal government. And
Hmm.
I think all of this conversation and dialogue and issues are an important part of were an important part of the electoral process. How canvassing was being done or how the electoral campaigns were being conducted. So for sure, I think these are important concerns to people. But how I treat them, how I look upon them, varies with the kind of political background that I sort of come from. That doesn't have a very clear answer. I can't even give you numbers like saying, okay, 90% people behave like. It's also contextual. I may believe some part, I may not believe another part, that kind of.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, we're going to be facing the same thing in November when the United States elections happen. So
by November, I mean, in another few months, when sort of campaigning picks up force, and you're going to see all of this playing out right there.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for giving me your time tonight.
Well, welcome. It's been a pleasure talking to you. So,
all right.
Yep.
All right. Take care now.
All right.